Okay, so welcome to the last part of the Chapter 14 lecture, aside from the cranial nerves portion. We're going to be talking about the cerebrum. So I've already covered the cerebellum and the brainstem, and the final part of the brain that we'll be discussing is the cerebrum. So this is the largest, most conspicuous part of the human brain, and generally when people think of brain, this is the image that comes to mind. So it's this very prominent, highly folded structure. And generally speaking, this is where our highest order functionality comes from. This is the seat of sensory perception, memory, thought, judgment, and voluntary motor actions. So various images of your cerebrum from the lateral view within the skull here. Superior view, you see the cerebral hemispheres here separated by the longitudinal fissure. This would be a view from the front of the brain, showing the cerebellum and the brainstem back here. And then this gives you a good idea of the relationship of the cerebrum to the other main parts of the brain. So if you were to remove the temporal lobe, you would be able to see your corpus callosum within here, your cerebellum, and then your brainstem. All right, so the cerebrum has what's known as regional organization. There are 5 primary lobes of the cerebrum, and if you have taken a psychology class, you're probably familiar with these lobes. So the frontal lobe basically underlies the frontal bone. It is rostral to a particularly prominent sulcus, known as the central sulcus. This is where we have a concentration of neurons involved in voluntary motor functions, motivation, foresight, planning, memory, mood, emotion, social judgment, and aggression. Parietal lobe is between the central sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus, and again the sulci are basically just grooves within that folded structure that makes up the outer part of the cerebrum. So these prominent sulci that are listed here are just the anatomical boundaries for the various lobes. So the parietal lobe integrates general senses, taste, and some visual information. The occipital lobe is caudal to the parieto-occipital sulcus, and this is our primary visual center of the brain, so this is where we first become aware of visual stimuli. Temporal lobe is lateral and horizontal. It's below the lateral sulcus, functions in hearing, smell, learning, memory, and some aspects of vision and emotion. And then the insula is hidden by other regions. So unless you remove other parts of the cerebrum, you're not going to be able to see the insula. It is deep to the lateral sulcus. It helps in understanding spoken language, taste, and integrating information from visual receptors. So you will notice that there's not necessarily very strict boundaries in terms of functionality. Many different regions of the brain will have slightly different specializations in terms of our special and general senses, but as you can see, there is some overlap oftentimes within the functionality of these lobes. So this shows you the various lobes of the brain. And again, psychology class, you've probably heard these terms before. Also, thinking back to our study of the skeletal system, these terms will be familiar to you from the bones of the cranium that we learned. So here's our insula in the brown color here. Again, you'd have to retract parts of the cerebrum, especially parts of the frontal lobe and temporal lobe, to be able to see that. So we have our frontal lobe, our parietal lobe, our occipital lobe, and our temporal lobes. And then again, not shown here is going to be the insula. That is going to be hidden by the other lobes of the cerebrum. Okay, so white matter. White matter, recall, is going to be white primarily due to myelination of axons. So anytime you see white matter in the brain, that should be an indication that you have communication happening either between different parts of the brain, or you have tracts going out to the peripheral nervous system, for example, or tracts coming in from the peripheral nervous system such that the CNS can process information. But again, that white matter is due to myelination. Those are the myelin sheaths around the axons of neurons. And there are fibers that form bundles or tracts of 3 different kinds. Fibers, recall, are just the axons of neurons. We have projection tracts, which carry information between the cerebrum and the rest of the body. Commissural tracts, which cross from one hemisphere to the other. And just a question regarding the commissural tracts. There is a prominent structure that connects the 2 cerebral hemispheres that's primarily made up of white matter. Can you think of what that is? That's going to be your corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is essentially one large commissural tract. And then the association tracts are going to connect different regions within a hemisphere. Okay, so looking at our tracts of cerebral white matter, we have our projection tracts here that are shown in green. We have our association tracts, which are shown in red. And then we have our commissural tracts shown in yellow, and this is basically showing an outline of that corpus callosum. All right, the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is basically the outermost layer of the cerebrum. It's the gray matter that is a functional outer layer of the cerebrum. And this is where you have neural integration. So cerebral gray matter is going to be found generally in 3 places: your cerebral cortex, your basal nuclei, and your limbic system. All right, so the cerebral cortex covers the surface of the hemispheres, and for whatever reason, I find that students get confused about the cerebral cortex a lot of the time because it doesn't really have these distinct anatomical boundaries, and a lot of students don't know what the difference between just the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex is. And I think it becomes most apparent when you're looking at like a coronal section here. So the cerebral cortex, all this is just the outermost layer of gray matter all over the cerebrum. So all of this gray matter is going to be your cerebral cortex. It covers the surface of the hemispheres. It is very thin. It's only 2 to 3 millimeters thick. However, the cortex is very densely packed with neurons. It constitutes about 40% of the brain mass. And you have to keep in mind that a lot of that is due to the fact that we have this highly complex folding. We have the gyri and the sulci. And those gyri and sulci impart a lot more functionality because you're essentially packing more surface area into this fairly limited space within the cranium. So the cortex does constitute a surprising amount of the brain's mass, about 40%. And that's including about 14 to 16 billion neurons. So about 90% of the human cerebral cortex is what is known as neocortex. This literally means new cortex because it is evolutionarily quite recent. We don't see this highly evolved structure in many other animals. And of course, we don't see anything like the human neocortex in any other animal. So it's a 6-layered tissue that has a relatively recent evolutionary origin. And this figure 14.12 just shows the different layers and how you have different types of neurons within those layers. So small and large pyramidal cells, and then your stellate cells throughout all of these layers of the cerebral cortex. Okay, basal nuclei. These are masses of cerebral gray matter buried deep in the white matter and lateral to the thalamus. So this is just part of an overview of the types of gray matter that you'll find in the cerebrum. So the one that we just covered is your cerebral cortex, which is this outer layer. Now we're looking at the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei are going to be highlighted in these various colors here. So they receive input from the substantia nigra of the midbrain and the motor areas of the cortex. They send signals back to both of those locations, and they are involved in motor control. So controlling muscle movements. The basal nuclei, as far as classification, there is some disagreement as to which parts of the gray matter to classify as basal nuclei, but at least 3 are generally agreed upon. So at least 3 brain centers form the basal nuclei and are collectively called the corpus striatum, the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and then the globus pallidus. And the putamen and globus pallidus together are known as the lentiform nucleus because they have a somewhat lens-like shape to them. So just to show you all the basal nuclei, the caudate nucleus here. So again, we have our corpus callosum, basically along the lateral margins of that, just inferior to the corpus callosum is going to be the caudate nucleus. The putamen out from the third ventricle towards the temporal lobe is going to be the basal nucleus known as the putamen. And then a slightly more restricted area a little bit closer to the third ventricle, the globus pallidus. Okay, the limbic system is an important center of emotion and learning. And some of the prominent components of the limbic system include the cingulate gyrus, which arches over the corpus callosum in the frontal and parietal lobes, the hippocampus in the medial temporal lobe, which serves for various memory functions, and the amygdala, which is immediately rostral to the hippocampus, and that functions in emotional functions. The purple highlighted area in this figure here is all of the limbic system together, and there is a limbic system in each of the cerebral hemispheres. Limbic system components are connected through a loop of fiber tracts that allow for somewhat circular patterns of feedback to occur, and the limbic system structures have centers for both gratification and aversion. So feelings of pleasure and then basically feelings of sorrow or pain. All right, let's look briefly at functional organization of the cerebral cortex. There are going to be specific types of sensory, motor, and integrative signals that are processed in certain regions of the cerebral cortex. There are going to be sensory areas, motor areas, and then association areas. So the primary sensory cortex are sites where sensory input is first received and one becomes conscious of the stimulus. The association areas near primary sensory areas process and interpret the sensory information, and these include primary visual cortex and multimodal association areas. The primary visual cortex is bordered by visual association areas that make cognitive sense of stimuli that we're seeing. So being able to recognize what we're seeing. And then the multimodal association areas receive input from multiple senses. So for example, sense of smell, sense of taste, eyesight, all of these different types of input are going to integrate into an overall perception of our surroundings. There are two language centers of the left hemisphere that I wanted to make a note of. The Wernicke area and the Broca area. And the Wernicke area uses knowledge of grammar to transmit a plan of speech to the Broca area. The Broca area then helps prepare us to speak or utilize sign language by generating a motor program to muscles involved in speech. So essentially, Wernicke area is using our existing knowledge of language and speech patterns and grammar to prepare a plan of action, which is then sent to the Broca area, which actually carries out the motor program that's necessary for us to actually speak or sign. All right, I want to talk a little bit about cerebral lateralization. You've probably heard this common misconception that some people are more left-brained, some people are more right-brained, and that's not really scientifically accurate. No matter if you are better at science and math or arts and music, you're going to be using both your left and right hemispheres of the cerebrum about equally. Now, what does differ is the specialization between left and right hemisphere. So typically, the left hemisphere is known as the categorical hemisphere. It is involved in rational thought. This is where we associate science ability and mathematics ability. And typically the right hemisphere is what's known as the representational hemisphere, which is more often associated with musical ability and artistic ability. However, this is not always the case. So this has a strong correlation with whether you're right-handed or left-handed. The left hemisphere is the categorical hemisphere in about 96% of right-handed people, whereas in left-handed people, the left hemisphere is the categorical one in only about 70% of people. So it's not always the case that the left is the categorical, the right is representational, but there is a strong correlation between handedness and which one is categorical. So cerebral lateralization basically can just be defined as the difference in the structure and function of the cerebral hemispheres. So typically your left hemisphere, as I stated previously, is the categorical hemisphere specialized for spoken and written language, sequential and analytical reasoning, so math and science, tends to specialize in breaking information into pieces and analyzing that, sort of a more mechanistic approach to thought processes. And your right hemisphere is usually going to be the representational hemisphere. So perceiving information in a more integrated or holistic way, it's typically the seat of imagination and insight, associated with musical and artistic skill, perception of patterns and spatial relationships, and comparison of different types of special senses, so our sight, sound, smells, and taste. And basically, to finish this lecture out, this is just a final image from Anatomy and Physiology Revealed of your two different cerebral hemispheres. So we have our left cerebral hemisphere here and our right cerebral hemisphere here. The longitudinal fissure is what separates those two. And then, of course, the corpus callosum provides for communication between those two hemispheres.